There is a sound that stayed with the people of Harrow Bluff, Louisiana, forever. Not the crack of a rifle, not the howl of a storm sweeping up from the bayou. Not even the morning hymns sung too many times across too many years. What they never forgot, what the oldest among them would still flinch at decades later if a church bell happened to ring unexpectedly near nightfall, was the sound of the bell at Calvary Road Baptist tolling 12 times on a Tuesday evening in October of 1872, when no hand had been seen pulling the rope and no service had been called for. 12 strikes, long and deliberate, the kind that don't echo. They settle into you the way a stone dropped into still water does. And by the following morning, every member of the Valcarn family, the wealthiest plantation household in the parish, had simply vanished. All 7 of them, gone from a house that was still warm, with supper half-eaten, and a single chair overturned at the head of the table. No struggle marked the scene, no note was left behind, no horses were missing from the stable. What was left behind was far stranger than what was taken. And what the county records show, the ones that weren't sealed by order of the parish judge, will make you wonder whether anyone in Harrow Bluff truly wanted the Valcarn family to be found at all. Before we continue with the story of the Valcarn family and the bell that rang without reason, if you're new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Not 12 times, just once is enough. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. What state? What city? We want to know who's listening tonight. 7 years after the end of the Civil War, the South was not a place at peace with itself. It wore the shape of peace, with rebuilt fences, reopened churches, gentlemen tipping their hats on unpaved streets, but underneath it seethed. The old order had cracked, but it hadn't broken cleanly, and the pieces were jagged enough to draw blood. The parish of St. Genevieve, tucked into the slow-moving bottom of Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin, had never been easy to reach and had never been easy to leave. Its largest settlement was a cluster of buildings along a ridge of slightly elevated ground that locals called Harrow Bluff. A name appearing on no official state map, but one everyone within 40 miles knew well enough. There was a general store run by a man named Dupree, a blacksmith, a post office operating out of someone's kitchen 3 mornings a week, and Calvary Road Baptist Church, standing since 1841 on the western edge of town, its white wooden steeple visible above the cypresses even when the morning fog off the water swallowed everything else. The Valcarn Plantation sat 3 miles south of Harrow Bluff along a road that flooded every spring and dried into hard ruts every summer. The main house wasn't the grandest in the region. Families in Natchez and Baton Rouge had considerably more marble and considerably less mud on their boots. But the Valcarns had always understood that longevity was its own form of power. They'd been in St. Genevieve Parish since before the Louisiana Purchase. They'd survived yellow fever, the British, the floods of 1849, and with considerably more difficulty, the outcome of the war between the states. The head of the household in the fall of 1872 was Edouard Valcarn, a man of 53, once considered handsome in the way men with money always are, and who had aged into something harder and more difficult to read. He'd served as a colonel in the Confederate Army, a fact he didn't discuss in the presence of the Union-appointed officials now administering the parish, and had returned from the war to find his fields partially burned, his workforce legally emancipated, and his finances in a condition he described to no one, refusing to acknowledge in writing. His wife, Henriette, was 3 years younger, and had lived most of her married life in the careful, watchful way of women who understand that their security depends entirely on the stability of someone else's temperament. She managed the household with precision, speaking in a low, measured voice that visitors often mistook for gentleness. They had 4 children. The eldest, Theodore, was 26, unmarried, widely regarded as unreliable, and in possession of his father's temper without his father's restraint. Then came Adele, 22, who had been engaged to a man from Opelousas who died of typhoid the previous year, and who hadn't, by any account that October, recovered her footing since. Leon was 17, quiet in the particular way that people notice only in retrospect, and the youngest was Margot, 13, who had inherited her mother's careful eyes and her father's refusal to display what she actually felt. That was 7, if you count the elderly Aunt Celeste Valcarn, 71, hard of hearing, sharp of mind, who occupied 2 rooms on the eastern side of the house and had been, in the years before the war, one of the most influential women in the parish. The 8th member of the Valcarn household, and this is the detail the official account would later work very hard to minimize, was not a Valcarn at all. His name was August, no surname in the county records. He had been, before emancipation, enslaved on the Valcarn property. He had remained after in a capacity poorly defined and inadequately compensated, as was common throughout the post-war South for men and women whose freedom had arrived faster than any system to support it. August was 44 years old, widely known in Harrow Bluff, and described in the single surviving account from that period as a man who remembered everything and said very little. He was not in the house when the family vanished. He was the one who found what they left behind. The evening of October the 14th, 1872, began without incident, which is to say it began the way most evenings in Harrow Bluff began, with the light going amber over the water, the insects starting up their machinery in the cypress roots, and the smell of wood smoke beginning to drift from the kitchens of the houses along the ridge. The Calvary Road church bell was set to ring twice daily, once at 7 o'clock in the morning and once at noon. Those were the customs, unvaried in 20 years. The bell was not rung at night. It was not rung on a Tuesday with no service scheduled. It was not rung 12 times in slow, deliberate succession, with pauses between each stroke long enough that a man walking from his porch to the edge of his property and back could count them without hurrying. But that is what happened at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening of October the 14th. Elias Fontenot, the owner of the general store, was locking up when he heard the first toll. He stopped, key in hand, and counted. His wife, Doree, walking back from her sister's house 2 streets over, heard it from the road and stood still in the mud and counted. The schoolteacher, a northern man named Graves, who had arrived 2 years earlier as part of the Reconstruction-era educational effort and had never been fully accepted, heard it through his boarding house window and wrote the count in his personal journal that same night. A journal that wouldn't surface until 1931 when his granddaughter donated it to a library in Ohio. 12 strikes, then silence. No one ran to the church immediately. That's a detail worth dwelling on. In later accounts, several people would say that something about the sound, its evenness, its patience, made them reluctant to move toward it. Fontenot described it as the kind of sound that tells you it is already done with you, whatever it is. His wife said she felt cold in a way unconnected to the temperature. It was Graves, the schoolteacher, who eventually walked to the church, arriving perhaps 15 minutes after the last toll. He found the door unlocked. It was rarely locked. This wasn't that kind of place. And he found the bell rope hanging straight and still. The sanctuary was empty. The candles on the altar weren't lit. A thin layer of dust on the floor at the base of the bell tower showed no fresh footprints. He told this to Fontenot the next morning, and Fontenot, practical by nature and suspicious of anything requiring more explanation than he had available, suggested the rope had swung loose in the wind, and the bell had moved on its own. This was technically possible. It had been a still evening without so much as a breeze off the bayou, but Fontenot offered this theory with the conviction of a man who needed it to be true. No one asked about the Valcarns that night. Why would they? The plantation was 3 miles south, and the Valcarns didn't involve themselves in the life of Harrow Bluff any more than they could avoid. It was August who came into town the following morning on foot at a pace that the people who saw him described later as not quite running, but not quite walking, something between the two that communicated urgency without abandoning the careful composure he had maintained his entire life. He came directly to the general store because that's where Fontenot was, and because Fontenot was, in the absence of any other authority, the closest thing Harrow Bluff had to a man who could be expected to act. He said, in the account Fontenot later gave to the parish sheriff, "The family is gone. All of them. I need someone to come." Fontenot asked him what he meant by gone. August said, "I mean they are not there. I mean the food is on the table. I mean the lamps are still burning. I mean go and see, because I don't have words for what I saw." They went, Fontenot, Graves the schoolteacher, and a man named Thibodeau who had been in the store at the time and who would spend the rest of his long life wishing he had simply walked the other direction that morning. The Valcarn house, on first inspection, looked entirely normal from the outside. The shutters were open as they would be on a warm October evening. The horses were in the stable, all four of them, which was the detail that first struck Fontenot as genuinely wrong, because even in the most abrupt of departures, horses go with their owners. The chickens were roosting in the yard. A dog, a large brown hound belonging to Theodore, was sitting on the front porch with its chin on its paws, watching the three men walk up the road, and it did not bark. It moved aside when they climbed the steps. It did not come inside. The front door was standing open. The interior of the house in that first October morning light was one of those images that, once described to you, becomes difficult to dislodge. The central dining room showed evidence of a meal in progress. 7 place settings with varying degrees of food remaining. A serving dish of sweet potatoes sat in the middle of the table, still covered. The bread basket had been partially emptied. 3 of the 7 glasses held wine. One chair, the one at the head of the table belonging to Edouard, had been overturned, but not violently. It had fallen backward, as a chair does when someone stands quickly and unexpectedly, without the force of anger. The candles had burned down to stubs in their holders, telling Graves, who noted this in his journal, that they'd been left burning for the better part of the night. There was no evidence of fire beyond this. No scorching, no ash except what had dripped from the candles themselves. In the kitchen, the stove was still warm. In the upstairs bedrooms, 2 of the beds had been turned down for the night but not slept in. Margot's room had a hairbrush set out on the dresser. Adele's had an open letter on the writing desk, blank, as if she had sat down to write and been interrupted before she could begin. Celeste's 2 rooms on the east side were as orderly as rooms belonging to a 71-year-old woman of discipline. Her Bible was opened on the table beside her chair, and her reading glasses were folded on top of it, as if she had set them down to rest her eyes and intended to return. There was no note. There was no indication of where 7 people had gone, on foot or otherwise, in an evening that 12 witnesses would later confirm had been entirely silent after the tolling of the church bell, with no sound of carriages or horses or voices carrying across the flat, water-saturated land in any direction. There was one other thing, and it's the detail left out of every official report filed in the subsequent investigation. In the narrow hallway connecting the main house to the back entrance, the servants' passage as it would have been called in the years before emancipation, scratched into the plaster of the wall at approximately shoulder height in characters that took Graves 3 full minutes to identify as an approximation of letters, were 7 marks. Not ornate, not ritual-looking in Graves's assessment, just marks, the kind a man makes when he wants to record something without being certain who will be able to read it. When Graves described this to the parish sheriff, who arrived 2 days later, the sheriff said he hadn't noticed any marks in the hallway. When pressed, he said the plaster in that section had been damp and unstable and had likely shed whatever had been scratched into it. There is no photograph. There is no physical record. There is only Graves's journal entry written that night, in which he drew what he remembered. 7 marks that he would spend the next 40 years trying to identify and never quite succeed. He had one theory, which he didn't record until 1889, 17 years after the event, in an addendum squeezed into the margins of the original entry. He thought, though he couldn't be certain, that the marks resembled numbers, that they were perhaps a count, and that the number they counted was 12. What followed the disappearance of the Valcarn family was not, by the standards of 1872 Louisiana, an investigation. It was the performance of an investigation, the going through of motions by men who were either genuinely baffled or genuinely relieved. And it wasn't always possible to tell which. The parish sheriff, a man named Arsenault, who had held the position since before the war and who had survived the transfer of power during Reconstruction by the simple expedient of making himself useful to whoever currently held authority, arrived at the Valcarn house 2 days after August's report. He was accompanied by 2 deputies and by the parish judge, a northerner appointed under the Reconstruction administration whose name was Harlan Pruitt, a man who in the 3 years since his appointment had developed the particular weariness of someone who has realized that the institution he represents is held in contempt by the majority around him and who has decided to work within those constraints rather than against them. Arsenault found nothing that Fontenot, Graves, and Thibodeau hadn't already found. He interviewed Auguste, who told him in careful, measured terms what he had seen and when. He interviewed Fontenot and Graves. He sent deputies to ask questions of the neighboring plantations, the Devereux property 1.5 miles to the north, the Broussard farm to the east, and received from both directions the same answer. Nothing unusual had been seen or heard on the evening of the 14th. What the investigation did not examine, at least not formally, was the Valcarn family's circumstances in the months preceding the disappearance. This was, depending on how charitable you wish to be about Arsenault's competence, either an extraordinary oversight or a very deliberate omission. Because the Valcarn family's circumstances in the fall of 1872 were not simple. The plantation had been operating at a loss since the end of the war. This wasn't unusual. The entire agricultural economy of the region had been restructured in ways the old planter class had never adequately adapted to. But the Valcarns' losses had a particular character. They had continued, in the years following emancipation, to operate their labor arrangements in ways that the Freedmen's Bureau had formally objected to on 3 separate occasions. The contracts offered to formerly enslaved workers were structured to keep those workers in a condition of perpetual debt. Charges for housing, for food, for tools tallied against wages set low enough to ensure the balance never resolved in the workers' favor. This wasn't uncommon in Louisiana in 1867 and 1868. By 1872, it had become, if not illegal in practice, then at least visible enough to attract unwanted attention. A man from the Bureau named Whitfield, one of the few names appearing in multiple independent records from this period, had visited the Valcarn property in March of 1872. His report, surviving in fragmentary form in a federal archive in Washington, described what he called conditions of informal bondage maintained through economic coercion and recommended formal action. The recommended action had not been taken. The reason it hadn't is unclear, though it's notable that Whitfield was transferred to a different assignment in Arkansas 6 weeks after filing his report. There were also financial obligations. The Valcarn property was mortgaged heavily to a bank in New Orleans that had extended considerable credit during the war years and was now, in the complicated financial landscape of Reconstruction, in the process of calling in its debts. The principal creditor was a man named Delacroix who had, according to 2 letters surviving in private correspondence, sent a representative to Harrow Bluff in September of 1872, 3 weeks before the disappearance, to discuss terms. Whether that meeting took place and what was said in it was never established. And then there was the matter of what Auguste knew. He wasn't formally interviewed as a witness. He was interviewed as what the period would have designated him, a laborer on the property with relevant information. The distinction mattered enormously in 1872 Louisiana because it affected what weight his account was given, what questions he was asked, and crucially, what questions he was not asked. What Auguste volunteered without being asked was this, that on the evening of October the 14th, he had been in his quarters, a small structure behind the main house separated from it by approximately 40 yards, and that he had heard the church bell. He had counted 12 strokes like everyone else. He had gone to his door and looked toward the main house, and he had seen in the windows of the dining room the moving light of candles. The family was at supper. Everything appeared normal. He had then returned inside his own quarters and gone to bed. In the morning, he had gone to the main house to begin his usual work and found what he found. He didn't say anything further in the formal interview. What he said to Graves privately, in a conversation that Graves recorded in his journal, was different. It was 3 sentences offered quietly without elaboration, and Graves wrote them down exactly as Auguste had spoken them. I knew something was wrong with that family 3 months ago. I knew it when I found the letters. I knew it when Theodore came back from New Orleans and wouldn't look at his father. Graves asked him, "What letters?" August looked at him for a long moment and said, "The kind that get burned before the wrong person reads them." And then he walked away. What the county records show, the ones that were not sealed, is that the investigation was formally closed 11 weeks after the disappearance in January of 1873 with a finding of cause undetermined. The Valcon property was placed in receivership by the New Orleans creditors within 4 months. The house stood empty for 6 years before being purchased by a family from Shreveport who moved in, found the arrangement unsatisfactory for reasons they declined to specify, and sold it again within a year. But the investigation was not the only mechanism by which people in Harrow Bluff tried to understand what had happened. There is a particular quality to the silence that a community maintains around events it cannot explain and does not want to examine too closely. It isn't the silence of ignorance. It's a busy, industrious silence. The kind that generates rumors, half-statements, glances exchanged across a room when a certain name is mentioned. Stories told in fragments that, taken together, assemble into something larger than any single piece suggests. And what those fragments assembled into over the months and years following October 1872 was this: the Valcon family had not been universally mourned. This is a statement requiring some elaboration, because not mourned covers a wide range of positions. There were people in Harrow Bluff who had been employed by, indebted to, or socially dependent on the Valcons, and who experienced their disappearance as a practical disruption of real consequence. Fontenot fell into this category. The Valcons had been among his best customers, and their accounts, though never settled, had provided the fiction of forthcoming income that kept his store solvent. But there were other people. Specifically, there were the men and women who had worked the Valcon fields since emancipation, some of whom had worked those same fields for decades before emancipation. For them, the word disappeared carried a resonance that the white residents of Harrow Bluff either did not perceive or chose not to acknowledge. Because these were people who had watched their own family members disappear before, in a different and more violent sense of the word, and who had never been invited to treat those disappearances as mysteries worthy of investigation. Their silence in the aftermath of October 1872 was not the same silence as Fontenot's. A woman named Rosalie, formerly enslaved, her age given inconsistently across different records as somewhere between 40 and 55, had been one of the workers who remained on the Valcon property after emancipation. She had 3 children. She had, in the 6 years between 1865 and 1871, accumulated enough in wages, or what were called wages, to pay off exactly none of her listed debts to the Valcon household accounts. When interviewed by Arsenault's deputies in the days following the disappearance, she said she had seen nothing unusual on the evening of October the 14th. She was not asked whether she had heard the church bell. She was not asked what she thought had happened to the family. She was not asked whether she knew anything about the letters August had mentioned to Graves. In 1889, when Graves returned to St. Genevieve Parish, having left for Ohio in 1874 and not been back in 15 years, he found that Rosalie had died in 1881. He found August still living in Harrow Bluff, now 61, working odd jobs and living in the same small structure behind what had once been the Valcon house, now owned by a hardware merchant from Shreveport who had never once asked why the structure remained on the property, or who was living in it. Graves walked back to find August on the afternoon of his second day back in town. He said in his journal that August looked older in ways he couldn't entirely attribute to time, that there was a quality of weight about him, a settled heaviness, as if he had been carrying something for 17 years and had long since stopped noticing it only because it had become indistinguishable from himself. They sat on the steps of August's structure and talked for approximately 2 hours. Graves recorded the conversation in detail. It's the most significant primary document pertaining to the Valcon case, and for reasons that will become apparent, it was never submitted to any official proceeding. August began not at the beginning but at a point 3 months before the disappearance, which placed them in July of 1872. That July, Theodore Valcon had traveled to New Orleans and returned changed. This wasn't entirely unusual. Theodore traveled to New Orleans occasionally to manage what remained of the family's business relationships there, and he often returned in a poor mood. But this time was different. August described it carefully. Theodore had returned with a particular kind of anger, the kind not looking for an object but already having one, and that object was his father. The two men had argued, August said, within hours of Theodore's return. Not in the house, in the stable, where they believed themselves alone, which they were not, because August had been working in the adjacent storage structure. He didn't hear everything. He heard enough. Theodore had found something in New Orleans, or had been told something. August wasn't certain which. What he was certain of was the phrase Theodore used, which August repeated to Graves in 1889 with the precision of a man who had turned a sentence over in his mind so many times that it had worn smooth. "You sold a man who was not yours to sell." And Edouard's response, quieter, more controlled. "That is not what happened." And Theodore, "Then tell me what happened. Tell me what you did with the money. Tell me where he went." The argument ended shortly after. August didn't know how. They had moved deeper into the stable, and he hadn't been willing to position himself more obviously. What he knew was that Theodore didn't come out of the stable for 2 hours, and when he did, he walked past August without looking at him in a way August described as like I was something he was ashamed to see. Now, here is where the account begins to layer in ways that require careful attention. Because what August told Graves in 1889 was not a simple story. It was a story with architecture, with rooms that opened onto other rooms, and some of those rooms were dark. And August had been deliberate about which ones he opened and which ones he left closed. Edouard Valcon, in the years before the war, specifically between 1857 and 1863, had engaged in a practice that was in those years legal but poorly documented, the sale of enslaved people across state lines into the Deep South cotton states, where conditions were considerably harsher and the likelihood of return correspondingly smaller. This wasn't uncommon. The coastal South, with its older, more established plantations, regularly sold surplus labor into the expanding territories. What distinguished Edouard from his contemporaries was not the practice itself, but the particular accounting he kept of it, which is to say he kept almost none. What Theodore had found in New Orleans, August believed, was a record. Not a complete record. Records of this kind were rarely complete, but enough of one to establish that Edouard had sold at least one person under conditions that were, even by the standards of the time, legally questionable. Specifically, a man who had been promised his freedom by Edouard's own father in a document executed in 1851, and whose freedom had therefore, under the law as it stood, already been legally established at the time of his sale. Edouard had known about the document. The money from the sale had gone to cover plantation debts. The man had gone to Mississippi. His name, as August gave it to Graves, was Thomas Dufresne, a free man of color who had worked as a carpenter, whose freedom papers had been issued in New Orleans, and whose subsequent sale into bondage had depended entirely on the destruction of those papers and the assertion that no such document had ever existed. Graves asked August how he knew this. August said, "Because I helped him write the letter to New Orleans asking for copies 3 years before the war. I was the one who could read." He looked at the fading light over the cypress line for a moment and then said, "He never got a response. We didn't know why then." Now Graves understood the letters, the ones August had mentioned 17 years earlier and declined to elaborate on. In the spring and summer of 1872, Thomas Dufresne, or someone acting on his behalf, or possibly a surviving family member, or possibly an attorney, had made contact with the Valcon household. Whether these letters were addressed to Edouard directly or came through some other channel, August didn't say. What he said was that he had found them unburned in a wastebasket in Edouard's study on a morning in late August when he had been cleaning the room and had recognized the handwriting on one of the envelopes. He did not read them. He said this plainly, and Graves believed him, because August was precise about what he did and did not know, and that precision was the most convincing thing about everything he said. He replaced them. He said nothing to anyone. And then 6 weeks later, the church bell rang 12 times on a Tuesday evening, and the Valcons were gone. Graves, sitting on those steps in 1889, asked the question he had been building toward for the entire conversation. Did August have any idea what had happened to the family? August was quiet for a long time. The sun had gone behind the cypresses. The insects had begun their evening work in the roots and the water. Then he said, "I have ideas. I don't have proof, and proof is the only thing that matters to you people." Graves said, "What do you mean?" August said, "I mean that I have been standing in this parish for 40 years, and I have watched proof protect the people who already have power and fail the people who don't. I have watched a man be sold out of his freedom and watched no one write it down because writing it down would be inconvenient. I have watched a family disappear and watched the sheriff spend 11 weeks pretending to look for them and spend 0 weeks asking any of the questions that might have actually found them. So when you ask me if I have ideas, yes, I have ideas. But I'm not going to give them to anyone who can use them to harm the people who may have finally had enough." This is the sentence that stopped Graves. He wrote it in capital letters in his journal with 3 lines beneath it, the way he underlined things he found significant. Harm the people who may have finally had enough. He did not press further. He thanked August and walked back to town in the dark, and the next morning he left Harrow Bluff and did not return. But Graves couldn't let the question rest. This is the thing about people who write things down. They create a problem for themselves, because writing sharpens the edges of what you know, and the edges of what August had told him were sharper than anything Graves had encountered in 17 years of quiet life in Ohio. He spent the next 4 years, from 1889 to 1893, engaged in what he called in his letters to a former colleague in New York a historical inquiry of personal concern. He wrote letters. He made 2 trips to New Orleans, where he spent time in the archives of the Freedmen's Bureau, in the records of the parish courthouse, and in the offices of 2 attorneys who had dealt with freedom cases in the 1850s and 1860s. What he found was this. Thomas Dufresne had existed. His freedom papers had existed, or rather the record of their having existed, in the form of a registry entry in New Orleans that recorded the issuance of the document in 1851 under the authority of a notary named Baudouin. The document itself was not in the registry. The entry was there. The paper was gone. Thomas Dufresne had been sold in December of 1858 to a plantation in Sunflower County, Mississippi. The sale record listed him as an enslaved man with no legal status. There was no notation of any conflicting documentation. The price paid was $420. After 1858, Thomas Dufresne's name didn't appear in any record Graves could find until 1867, when a man of that name, age listed as approximately 45, occupation carpenter, was registered with the Freedmen's Bureau in Natchez, Mississippi. This man had been emancipated by the 13th Amendment in 1865. He had spent 2 years working in Natchez. In 1869, he had traveled to New Orleans. The Freedmen's Bureau records showed no further entries after 1869. In a New Orleans city directory for 1871, a Thomas Dufresne, carpenter, was listed at an address in the Treem neighborhood. In the 1872 directory, the listing was gone. Graves couldn't find what had happened to Thomas Dufresne after 1872. He couldn't find a death certificate. He couldn't find a forwarding address. He couldn't find any record of his leaving New Orleans. He could find, in the records of a New Orleans law office, a record of a consultation in March of 1872 between A.T. Dufresne and an attorney named Bonville concerning a civil matter described only as recovery of status and damages. The case had not proceeded to filing. Graves stared at that entry for a long time. Recovery of status and damages. March 1872. And then 6 months later, in October, the church bell rings 12 times and the Valcon family is gone from their house. Something had happened in that interval. Something had moved. But here is what Graves could not determine, and what remains, to the extent that anyone has pursued this question, which is almost no extent at all, the central unresolved matter of the entire affair. Who rang the bell? Not in the sense of the physical action, though that was never explained either, but in the sense of intent. The bell had been rung. Someone had wanted it rung, and the ringing had been heard by everyone in Harrow Bluff, had fixed the time, had created a collective witness to the hour at which the evening had broken from its ordinary course. If the tolling was meant to signal something, a departure, a summoning, a deadline, then someone had known what was going to happen that evening. And if someone had known, then the disappearance of the Valkan family was not an event that had simply occurred. It was an event that had been arranged. Graves wrote this in his journal on the night of November 14, 1893, exactly 21 years after the bell had rung. He underlined it once. He did not sleep well that night. Just when we thought the mystery of Harrow Bluff might have a simple answer, just when it seemed we were close to the edge of what could be known, the truth turned out to have more layers. If this story is giving you chills, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because what Graves found in the following months changed everything he thought he understood about that Tuesday in October. There is a tendency in stories like this one to arrive eventually at a single explanation, a clean, manageable truth that accounts for all the details and allows the listener to close the book. This story does not offer that. What it offers instead is something that, depending on your disposition, you may find more disturbing or less, a convergence of pressures, a set of circumstances so precisely aligned that what happened in Harrow Bluff on October 14, 1872, seems in retrospect almost inevitable. Let us assemble what we know. Edouard Valkan had, in 1858, sold a man named Thomas Dufresne under circumstances that were at minimum legally questionable and at maximum an act of deliberate fraud against a free person. He had done this to cover a debt. The transaction had been possible because the paper documentation of Dufresne's freedom had been removed from the chain of records, whether by Edouard directly or by an intermediary. Graves was never able to establish. In the spring of 1872, Thomas Dufresne, having survived 8 years of bondage in Mississippi, having been emancipated in 1865, having worked his way back to New Orleans, had taken the first formal steps toward seeking legal redress. He had consulted an attorney. He had apparently made contact with someone at the Valkan plantation in some form that produced letters that Edouard felt the need to destroy. Theodore Valkan had traveled to New Orleans in July of 1872 and had learned something there, possibly from Dufresne's attorney, possibly from Dufresne himself, possibly from the legal filing that had been contemplated, that had caused him to confront his father. The confrontation had produced an argument in which Theodore had used the phrase, "You sold a man who was not yours to sell." The Freedmen's Bureau representative had filed a report on the Valkan property in March of 1872 recommending formal action. He had been transferred to Arkansas 6 weeks later without that action being taken. The New Orleans creditor had sent a representative to discuss the plantation's mortgage in September of 1872. And on October 14, 1872, the church bell had rung 12 times at 6:45 in the evening, and by morning the family was gone. Now, what Graves found in 1893, the piece he had not found in his earlier inquiries, came from an unexpected source. He had, through the former colleague in New York, obtained an introduction to a man named Harlan Pruitt, who had been the parish judge appointed during Reconstruction and who had been present at the formal investigation of the Valkan disappearance. Pruitt had left Louisiana in 1874 shortly after the formal ending of Reconstruction and had been living in upstate New York for nearly 20 years. He was in his 60s. He had, Graves's colleague reported, a reputation for drinking too much at certain social occasions and saying more than he should. Graves visited Pruitt in the autumn of 1893 in a house near Rochester and spent 2 evenings in conversation with him. He took notes, though not verbatim. Pruitt had asked him not to write things down while he was speaking, which Graves honored, transcribing from memory in his hotel room each night. What Pruitt told him was this. In the week before the investigation was formally closed in early January of 1873, Arsenault, the parish sheriff, had come to Pruitt privately, outside of any official proceeding, and had told him that he had learned something about the Valkan disappearance. He would not file it officially. He would not attach his name to it. But he wanted the judge to know. What Arsenault had learned was that on the evening of October the 14th, 1872, 7 people had left the Valcarn house on foot, moving south from the property and into the lower bayou country. They had been seen, not by a white witness whose account would have been admitted into a formal proceeding without question, but seen nonetheless, by a man whose name Arsenault gave to Pruitt, and which Pruitt gave to Graves, and which Graves wrote in his hotel room that night. The man's name was Henri Baptiste, and he had been working a fishing line in the bayou that evening, less than a quarter mile from the southern boundary of the Valcarn property, and he had seen